The author of this video does not believe that being Presbyterian makes one racist, nor that the Presbyterian Church stands for racism or slavery at this time. But this is a response to those misrepresenting historical evidence for the sake of historical truth.
Oh!
This is a source from the Presbyterian Outlook by Leslie Scanlon, following a student from Columbia Theological Seminary who is part of the Presbyterian Church, writing on the long history of slavery and racism in the Presbyterian Church. Let's see here. So I'm just going to highlight some of this. The history of the Presbyterian Church is deeply entwined with the violence and inhumanity of slavery, and with a history of anti-Black racism that allowed white Presbyterians to offer a theological rationale for the degradation and abuse that they perpetuated. That's the ugly history that William Yu, an assistant professor of American religious and cultural history at Columbia Theological Seminary, excavates in his new book, What Kind of Christianity? A History of Slavery and Anti-Black Racism in the Presbyterian Church, just released from Westminster John Knox Press. As Yu led members of the Presbyterian Mission Agency Board and staff in September 29 discussion of his book in Stony Point, New York, some church leaders present said the shadows of inequality and racism he laid bare are still all too visible in the church today. It took me 3 days to get through chapter 1 because I was so traumatized by what you wrote, said Denise Anderson, a former General Assembly co-moderator and now acting director of racial equity and women's intercultural ministries at the Presbyterian Mission Agency. In 2022, Black Presbyterian witness is as weak as it has ever been, Anderson said. Judgment will come upon this church. God has been far too patient with us. If an African American had written this book instead of a Korean American, it would have been resisted and rejected out of hand, said Gregory Bentley, another former General Assembly co-moderator. This is a kairos moment, it's Greek, for the PCUSA, the time to do urgent work of repentance and repair, Bentley said. The window of opportunity is closing for us to do right. Yu starts his book with a quote from womanist theologian Katie Geneva Cannon, the first Black woman to be ordained as a minister in the PCUSA, who asked, "Where was the church and the Christian believers when Black women and Black men, Black boys and Black girls were being raped, sexually abused, lynched, assassinated, castrated, and physically oppressed? What kind of Christianity allowed Christians to deny basic human rights and simple dignity to Blacks? These same rights which have been given to others without question." The most obvious answer to Cannon's question, Yu has written, is the wrong kind of Christianity, but the kind that white Presbyterians often have practiced. First chapter of Yu's book, these are some of his findings. Presbyterians refuse to denounce slavery. When given a chance to stand against slavery, Presbyterians wouldn't. At the 1836 General Assembly in Pittsburgh, Chillicothe Presbytery sent a letter calling enslavement of Blacks a heinous sin and scandal and demanding action against slavers, including barring them from receiving communion. A committee considered the issue, responded with a majority report explaining in only 211 words that to take a stand either defending it or supporting emancipation would be divisive. The committee postponed action several times to deal with an unrelated disciplinary matter involving a white male minister. In the end, the assembly voted to indefinitely postpone a vote on the matter, determining that the PCUSA Constitution could not bind the individual conscience from slavery. In 1845, Frederick Douglass wrote in his autobiography about the difference between genuine Christianity and the corrupt, slaveholding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. A criticism that is certainly true of Presbyterianism, Yu writes. White ministers, congregations, and church members all were enslavers. Based on available data, Yu estimates that in 1860, 50,000 to 75,000 white Presbyterians were slavers. Some of these Presbyterians, including ministers, are guilty of committing acts of physical, psychological, sexual, and spiritual abuse against enslaved persons. Yu wrote, citing as one example, Elizabeth Keckley, who was enslaved by a Presbyterian family, beaten severely when she was 4 years old, endured an anguishing parting from her father when she was separated from his family and sent west, was whipped by a white minister with whom she was forced to live, was stripped naked by a school principal who was a member of the minister's congregation, and was raped and impregnated by a white man. Presbyterians were not abolitionists, at least relatively few were, and those who were tended to either leave the Presbyterian church or be marginalized within it, Yu writes. In addition to documenting Presbyterians' direct involvement with enslaving Black people, Yu also traces the ongoing legacy and impact of that history, its impact on white Americans and churches today. He cites the work of James M. Lowen, a sociologist who argued that history textbooks tend to present slavery as some kind of uncaused tragedy, rather than teaching students about the cruelty and intentionality of the enslavers. When moving from high school classrooms to seminary and Sunday school classrooms, the miseducation on slavery is no less a problem, describing the glaring omission of the role that white Christians played. In his presentation, Yu highlighted for the board 3 specific incorrect interpretations that have led us astray for centuries. Now, he's a Presbyterian now. First, that white Christians, white Presbyterians, they didn't know. They didn't know how bad it was. Surely if they knew, they would have done something about it. Yu said that despite all his research, he sees this history as at a distance he can't traverse. I can never know how bad it was, but white people at the time, people who lived the history and saw the realities firsthand, they did know. Second, that errors in biblical interpretation were the reason for white Presbyterians' support of slavery. That if whites just read the Bible differently, they would have acted differently. Seminarians say, look at how they weaponized the Bible by proof texting particular passages. That narrow focus on flawed biblical interpretation is missing the point, Yu said, because it ignores whites' deep complicity in a violent system that exploited Black bodies. Third, that division of Presbyterian church over slavery was what people should be most sad about, that it was the greatest price paid. Too often, white Presbyterians grieve the ways that slavery split the church, the broken bonds of fellowship and denominational divisions, Yu wrote, more so than the agony that Black people endured at the time in the bodies and memories of Black people today. In reality, the greatest tragedy from this period of history was not church schism, but the perpetration of atrocities upon millions and millions of Black Americans. It was a sin for our church not to separate sooner. Okay, now let's see. I'm going to read this from Benjamin Baker. This is called The Woman Who Wouldn't Be Quiet, a fresh look at Ellen White and racism. I stared at him in disbelief. He couldn't be serious. What did you say? I asked. I said Ellen White was racist. His voice seemed to grow in boldness, as if speaking the words validated his assertion. I stood there shocked, surprised, somewhat amazed at this bold accusation and his apparent conviction concerning his statement. shook my head and silently prayed that God would help my associate to see things accurately and clearly and have mercy on this poor man's ignorance. As time passed since that incident, I realized that the person conversing with me was not the only one who shared those sentiments. Many people, black and white, question Ellen White's views on race and race relations. Because of certain statements she has made, individuals, Adventists and non-Adventists alike, question whether her racial views were biblical and balanced. This article is intended to shed light on the often misunderstood topic. To understand this topic better, one must first understand the times Ellen White Gould lived in. She lived in a time when the practice of slavery was at its zenith and black people were considered to be products rather than people. Their rights were stripped away as in the southern states where slavery was practiced, or as in the north where black people, even the freed ones, had very few rights and who were viewed with suspicion. Society as a whole was against the black race. In both the North and South, even progressive individuals struggled with confused views on race, the black race in particular. While slavery was the business of the day in the South, in the North slavery was present but in a different form. The Negro was considered less than a human being and was often treated like an animal. Day after day, horrific, unmentionable crimes were committed against the black race. Too often, only faint protests were heard. Society turned its head and acted as if it were unaware of these heinous crimes. Fortunately, or more correctly, providentially, as time passed, more and more people began to speak up. God responded to the cries of oppression by raising courageous individuals who heralded the injustices of slavery and demanded freedom for the black race. There were such people as Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, Angela Grimke, and numerous Millerite believers. These are among the true heroes of history. As the issue of slavery in the South reached a boiling point, the North and South became locked in opposing positions. The Civil War began in 1861. Through the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, superior resources, and the divine intervention of heavenly forces, the North prevailed and slavery was abolished. Though the war ended, literally decades passed before black people reaped the true benefits of freedom. Once again, good people, women and men, white and black, stood up for and acted on behalf of the black race. Ellen White was one of those good people who stood and spoke on behalf of black people. She saw the injustices and oppression and courageously began to articulate to the Seventh-day Adventist Church the needs of the black race in fresh and innovative ways. The Lord had freed the slaves. Now more than ever, the gospel could and should be preached to them. Now was the time black people could better hear the truth, live the truth, and join God's special movement, the newly formed Seventh-day Adventist Church. At first, Adventist leaders paid little attention to Ellen White. They ignored, dismissed, or generally neglected her insistent admonitions. Perhaps this was just a prophetic trend in her mind that would soon go away, but she wouldn't let up. She confronted the audience by saying, "Sin rests upon us as a church because we have not made greater effort for the salvation of souls among the colored people." We must keep in mind the times in which Mrs. White lived. Around the late 1880s, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was still a burgeoning organization. Its members were fairly progressive thinkers, yet many were still deeply influenced by spiritual immaturity and immature views on the race question and how they should interact and associate. During this time, when calling for positive action on behalf of black people, Ellen White cautioned care in how blacks related to whites and how they displayed social interaction before society. In general, Mrs. White advocated great wisdom and balance in race relations. Ellen White's insistent call to the church to act on behalf of black people came to the forefront in a dramatic manner. On March 21, 1891, she addressed the leaders at a general conference session in Battle Creek, Michigan. Many thought she was going to give a nice, respectable talk on the love of God, the unity of the church, or even the newfound emphasis on righteousness by faith. But no, she had a disturbing word of present truth from the Lord about what? About our duty to the colored people. Those present were about as startled as the Jews were when Christ in the Sermon on the Mount challenged his followers to love the Gentiles and treat them kindly. Ellen White made bold statements and set noble challenges that dramatically confronted the mores and practices of her day. She fearlessly made a case for the Black race as no other Seventh-day Adventist leader had done before. In fact, she was ahead of her time. Her message was passionate and powerful. She spoke from a heart of love for the Blacks in the South and in principle for all those who were oppressed. She spoke as one who had wanted Black people to have an opportunity to receive the gospel even as the white race was receiving it. So let me read that. I'm going to read that. Let me pull that up. The message from that Battle Creek presentation. Let me see. Okay, good. Let's see. This is the Southern Work, page 9 through 18. I'm going to read part of it at least. Let me find the... Okay, this is page 9, paragraph 41, or it's 41.3. Let's see. Those who study the history of the Israelites should also consider the history of slaves in America who have suffered, who have been educated in crime, degraded and oppressed, and left in ignorance to perish. Their physical freedom was obtained at a great loss of life, and Christians generally should have looked with compassion upon the colored race for which God had care. They should have done a work for them that would have uplifted them. They should have worked through the wisdom of God to educate and train them. We have been very neglectful of our colored brethren and are not yet prepared for the coming of our Lord. The cries of these neglected people have come up before God, who has entered into the work since their deliverance from bondage to teach them the knowledge of God. The condition of the colored people is no more helpless than was the condition of the Hebrew slaves. The children of Israel were addicted to licentiousness, idolatry, gluttony, and gross vices. This is ever the result of slavery, but the Lord looked upon his people, and after their deliverance, he educated them. They were not left uncared for. Though they had lost in years of bondage the knowledge of the true God and of his holy law, yet God again revealed himself to them. Walls of separation have been built up between the whites and the blacks. These walls of prejudice will tumble down of themselves as did the walls of Jericho when Christians obey the word of God, which enjoins them on the supreme love to their Maker and impartial love to their neighbors. For Christ's sake, let us do something now. Let every church whose members claim to believe the truth for this time look at this neglected, downtrodden people or race that, as a result of slavery, have been deprived of the privilege of thinking and acting for themselves. They have been kept at work in the cotton fields, have been driven before the lash like brute beasts, and their children have received no enviable heritage. Many of the slaves have noble minds, but the fact that their skin was dark was sufficient reason for the whites to treat them as though they were beasts. When freedom was proclaimed to the captives, a favorable time was given in which to establish schools and to teach the people to take care of themselves. Much of this kind of work was done by various denominations, and God honored their work. Those who attempted to work for the black race had to suffer persecution, and many were martyrs to the cause. It was difficult to educate the people in correct ideas because they had been compelled to do according to the word of their human masters. They had been subject to human passions. Their minds and bodies had been abused, and it was very hard to efface the education of these people and to lead them to change their practices. But these missionaries persevered in their work. They knew that the black man had not chosen his color or his condition, and that Christ had died for him as verily as he had died for this white brother. To show sympathy for the released slaves was to expose oneself to ridicule, hatred, and persecution. Old-time prejudice still exists, and those who labor in behalf of the colored race will have to encounter difficulties. The neglect of the colored race by the American nation is charged against them. Those who claim to be Christians have a work to do in teaching them to read and to follow various trades and engage in different business enterprises. Many among the race have noble traits of character and keen perception of mind. If they had had an opportunity to develop, they would stand upon an equality with the whites. So this is from, you can, I'll leave this. In fact, I'll put it in the live stream right now so you can find the source and you can read the whole thing for yourself if you want to, what Ellen White's views were, how she condemned the mistreatment of her fellow human beings of the colored race. So, there you have it.